Hello. We've talked before here on the channel about the many amazing roles that go into making Games Workshop and its games possible. But one thing that we've not really delved into too deeply is the art of casting. The actual making of the miniatures that we use in the games that we love. My guest today has spent a career becoming an expert in the science and the art of making molds and casting miniatures. He learned how to make molds alongside Bryan Ansell back in the early days of Citadel, and he became a master mould maker for Games Workshop later in his career. He has since moved on to working with Perry Miniatures and many other miniatures manufacturers, and he really is one of the industry's finest examples of casting brilliance. And alongside stories of all of that professional magnificence, he tells us stories of the times after school that he used to play wargames with Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with master mould maker and caster, Anthony Epworth. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me. The first thing I was keen to sort of explore was how you first got into miniature gaming. Sort of where did your journey start?
Right, well, it started in 1969. Obviously, I went to the library where I was living in Balderton in Newark and got out a book which was Charge by Brigadier Peter Young,
Right, okay.
which was one about 3 or 4 wargaming books that had all been published in the previous few years. And obviously, interest, and there were some addresses at the back, and I ordered some soldiers off a company called Lanning Miniatures.
Oh, right, okay.
Who were based in Knaresborough at the time. Right. They later moved to Hull, but they were based in sort of that area of Yorkshire.
Right.
I've still got them. They're at. I keep them at work in boxes. But I've still got all my old figures, all badly painted. They were painted by an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old, i.e. me at the time. And yeah, I've still got them at work.
Amazing. That's great.
That was 1969. I lived in Newark, but in 1971, my parents moved to Lincoln. I went to grammar school in Lincoln. Now, in Lincoln, there are 2 grammar schools. Right? There's the Lincoln School, which I went to, and the City School, which Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell went to.
Right.
So one was on the top of the hill, which was mine, and one was sort of further down in the flatlands, southwest of the city, which is where Rick and Hal went. And obviously, during this time, I was still spending all my spare cash on metal soldiers from companies like Minifigs.
Right.
And in Lincoln, there was a shop called the Model Shop. It's not there anymore. It was in an arcade, and that's gone as well. And he sold metal miniatures, Hinchcliffe.
Right.
In 1972, he said, I'm setting up a wargames club in Lincoln. And so September 1972, the Lincoln Model Railway and Wargaming Society was formed. And it was a place called Hungate, which if you're talking miniatures, you'll see a photograph of it was just a terraced house. But That was the terraced house on the right of the arch. In the middle of that photo is where the Lincoln Model Railway and Wargaming Society was based.
Right.
It was, I think there's about 10, 15 wargamers. I have no idea how many Model Railway enthusiasts were, but they had the upstairs and we had the downstairs. And it was open Thursday evenings and Sundays. I used to go and have war games, and initially all the things in World War II, which I wasn't particularly interested in. And then this, after a few weeks, this guy turned up with long hair, and it was Richard Halliwell, and he was into ancients, which I quite enjoyed ancients. So I finally found a war gamer to war game with.
Yeah.
And it was Hal. And he said, I've got another friend who I'm trying to persuade to come along. And that was Rick. Certainly by the end of 1972, I knew both Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley.
Right.
We were the sort of non-World War II war games in the club. So we used to play these ancient games using using the current rules that were popular at the time, which was just was just starting to be the War Games Research Group.
Right.
I think it was 3rd edition. And do you know much about War Games Research Group?
I'm familiar with the name. I've never played it myself.
Well, they're very dry.
Right.
That's the best way to describe them.
Sure.
They were dry.
Right.
And basically, the ancient rules weren't too bad. The World War II rules, I presume, weren't too bad either. But the horse and musket rules, because they didn't cover a specific war or period like Republican Romans, say, or Imperial Rome. Ancient covered everything from 3000 BC to 1485.
Right.
And horse and musket was 1485 to I think about 1900.
Right.
And theoretically, you could pit any army against any army.
Sure.
So you could have ancient Egyptians fighting Norman conquest or something
Right.
like that. And it was popular at the time, but they were dry.
Sure.
But so as the early 70s wore on, the War Games Research Group did a magic supplement, which was the first fantasy game,
right?
The War Games. So, trying to remember, right? I think it was 5th edition, and basically had the ancient rules with this magic supplement.
Right.
And Hal and Rick were quite pleased about them. And at the same time, a company called Minifigs.
Sure. Yeah.
Started producing Middle-earth figures.
Okay.
And if you go to Rick Priestley's blogspot, Notitia Metallicum.
Okay.
If you look through that, you'll see the actual figures that we used. He's refurbishing them and basically tarting them up so that they look nice.
Yeah.
They were the figures we used for the first Middle-earth games, using War Games Research Group, Ancient Rules with a magic supplement. So that'd be about 1974
right.
into 1975. And then we sort of got overtaken by being in sixth form, which our interests were diverted,
sure.
to drink and trying and failing miserably to impress women,
right?
Girls. So that there was a lull, and we eventually we sort of went back to wargaming. But in the interim period, Hal wanted to write his own rules because the war game research group rules were dry, and we started going around to his place, and we started developing what was the Reaper?
Right. Yeah.
The game, the Reaper rules.
Sure. The fantasy rules.
The fantasy rules, yeah, which were published by Tabletop Games,
right?
I think. Bob Connor and his Nottingham group. So Reaper got published. I mean, not published like today. It was basically photocopies and a ring binder down the side. But they got published, and what was the other game? He then started on a science fiction skirmish rule, a fistful of credits.
Okay, right.
And for a few credits more.
Right.
We spent 2 or 3 years in the late 70s play testing them and playing them, and it was fun. It was fun. It was good fun.
Yeah.
But it was a breakaway from the War Games research group and into a more playable, fun game. Because obviously, by this time, we had other interests, which was socialising, and war games had to fit into a period before we decided to go out socialising. And being the 1970s, all pubs shut at 10:30, 11 o'clock.
Right.
So you had to be out, and you had to finish your game by sort of 8:30, 9 o'clock at the latest, so you could get some post-game analysis.
Sure.
So then we all went to our respective universities. Hal went to Nottingham, Rick went to Lancaster, and I went to Hull. But we still used to meet up a few weekends and holidays, and we still used to play games together. I think Hal used to come back to Nottingham, to Lincoln fairly often at the time, and we used to meet up, and things ticked along. Then we all left universities and failed to get jobs because it was I remember I left university a month after Margaret Thatcher got into power.
Right.
And the wind of change were blowing.
Sure.
Getting jobs wasn't that easy. So I got a job back in Lincoln, working for Lincolnshire County Council. Rick didn't work at all, but Hal said, I've got a job making moulds at Citadel Miniatures. This would be 1980.
Right.
And possibly, about 1980. And he lived in Nottingham, worked in Newark, and used to come out drinking in Lincoln with us.
Right.
So he used to leave Nottingham when he got up in the afternoon, go to Newark, make moulds, then come over to Lincoln to socialise.
Right.
And that's when Hal started working as a mould maker at Citadel.
Right.
Now, at the time, I think Duncan McFarlane was still in charge.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it had been set up by Bryan.
Right.
Under the auspices of Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston.
Right.
But Bryan left, Duncan was put in charge. I don't think it was doing too well.
Right.
They wanted. Eventually, they got Bryan back in 1981.
Right.
And then Hal came to me. He would be in the pub one night. I think Bryan's been put back in charge of Games Workshop. Sorry, Citadel Miniature. Games Workshop came later. Would you be interested in getting a job there? Because he's looking for staff. And I said, oh yeah, working at, well, I suppose he thought he was like working in a sweet factory, but I had the problems, but go with it. But yes, I want to enjoy my job at Lincolnshire County Council. So I said yes, and the first thing we did was he said, "Oh, come over to Nottingham, you and Rick, and we'll go out and we'll meet Bryan and his girlfriend." Obviously, at that time was Diane Lane, who became Diane Ansell, and we went to. We ended up at Rock City,
right?
Seeing who was it? Band called Odyssey.
Okay.
And they did, going back to my roots. I know they did that. And then we went to an Indian restaurant, and Bryan said, "Oh well, come over for an interview." And this would be late 1981. And he says, basically, was, "Do you want a job? Please. When can you start? Well, how about beginning of the new year, 1982?" And I started work at Citadel on January 4th, 1982. The first Monday of 1982. I think it was. I started work, and Rick said, "Oh, no, I don't want a job. I want to stay in bed." Okay. And it started work at Citadel, and we, Hal was still mould making, but he was getting more and more. I think he was trying to concentrate on rule writing, which he was doing, which eventually morphed into Warhammer.
Right.
Hal was doing the mechanics of Warhammer, and Bryan was keen to get Rick employed because Rick could work with Hal, organise Hal,
right,
and get things set down on paper, which eventually we managed to get done by the end of January 1982. And in the Talking Miniatures book, there's a group photograph, isn't there?
Right.
Of staff at Citadel, which I haven't got it to view, but it's got Rick with the very long hair right in the middle at the front. I know he hasn't got it anymore, but I always picture Rick with hair that he could tuck into his belt.
Right.
Which, well, that's Rick, isn't it? For me. And Bryan's on it, I'm on it, and Alan Merritt's on it, and Diane Lane to become Diane Ansell's on it. The other people, I think, have sort of, one's Diane's sister, the other are warehouse staff.
Right.
Which some of whom names I can't remember. Sure. So that was January, February 1982. And basically I worked for Citadel from beginning of 82 to 1987.
Right.
Then I worked for Wargames Foundry
Right.
from 1988 to 1994, which is where I learned how to make molds.
Right.
And Bryan taught me how to make mold. I think the lesson lasted an hour.
Right.
It's just long enough to make a mold.
Right.
You basically, you do this, you do that, do a ring, cut feeds to it, do a bit of benching, test it, and anything that else needs drilling, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Any problems, get back to me.
Okay.
That was my mold making lesson.
Right.
So, and then I went back to Games Workshop in 1994 for a second period of 5 years till back end of 1999. Then I thought, right, I'm going. Because there've been winds of change, obviously, in that period. And I don't really like working here anymore.
Sure.
So I set up my own business, making initially to make freelance mold making and just mold making to start off with, but the casting came as part of it, and eventually Alan and Michael Perry said, we're setting up, we don't want to make figures for Bryan anymore, we're setting up doing our own historical company, and that's where Perry Miniatures come in, and I've been doing them since 2001.
Right.
I think around about September time 2001 they landed the first figures on me, which were the English Civil War figures. A discussion with Alan and Michael says you got to do something easy to design and produce to kick off. You can't just sort of start making thousands and thousands of Napoleonics.
Sure.
Because you're never going to finish them. But the English Civil War was a conveniently small range to start off with. Both sides wore the same gear, and got them off to a range fairly quickly.
Yeah. Was it so? I mean, that obviously is an amazing overview of the career. Then, so if we jump back briefly just to that first period at Citadel and Games Workshop, so you weren't actually mold making and casting during that period, or what was your?
No, I mean during the first 1982 to 87, everybody got set on as a warehouse staff, which is a generic term for do everything.
Right.
And the only thing everybody, all males, all men, got taught how to cast.
Right.
And,
mine will probably get involved soon enough. So.
Yeah. So everyone's taught how to cast, and you're expected to do a few weeks just to get up to speed and know the process, so that you could go to a casting machine and use it and not destroy it or kill yourself.
Right.
So everybody could cast.
Right. Because that would have been metal casting, right? The centrifugal casting.
I mean, one of the questions sent me how casting changes. Almost exactly the same.
Right.
Stop getting excited. It's exactly the same as I can remember in 1982.
Right.
The machines do exactly the same thing. Basically, they're about waist height, 2 to 2.5 feet square, and basically it's just a spinning plate that pushes up against the top plate, and it spins, and you put the mold in, and you pour metal down the middle of it. That's the process. Difficulty is the shape inside. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't.
Right.
But most things can be got to work. I mean, I do all sorts of things. And and yeah, I mean, we all learned to cast in even Rick, who's basically was set on as a games designer. You know,
Right.
you could put a, you know, he could stand next to a casting machine and cast figures.
Right.
But I stayed in the warehouse. Eventually, I was when the company moved to Eastwood in 1984. I was organising the work. I was basically doing day-to-day running of the warehouse.
Right.
Uh, not the production, not the casting side or the packing, but basically once the figures had been cast and packed, they came to me, and all the orders were collated and sent out to various either games workshops or or independent retail stores.
Right. Okay. So what was the sort of the feel and the kind of culture of Citadel in those early days when you and Hal and Rick had first started?
Well, Hal was never a permanent member of staff. Hal worked freelance, and he wanted his reason for working was to generate money to go on one of his overseas jaunts. He liked going to places like India and Thailand, and for as long as possible. So what tended to happen, he'd go away for 6 weeks, run out of money, come back, do some mold making, bit of games designing, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think eventually he did have a proper job at the Games Workshop studio,
right,
in games design, but that would be in the mid 80s when we moved to Nottingham. He was at Enfield Chambers, and I think he was at the Castle Boulevard site. Can't be quite sure on that. Then he went off. He eventually went off to America for a brief period of time. But I stayed in the warehouse, and it even then I found it a bit not really what I wanted to do. It's going to be cut and thrust, and there were people. Obviously, it was the going up leagues. You know, it started off like a war games production company, but you could feel it was going up. Up through the Championship into the Premier League. Certainly by 1985, 86.
Yeah.
And so eventually, let's say we parted ways in 1987. But I went to work for Wargames Foundry, which was obviously a small company, dealing with historical figures that Alan and Michael were producing.
Which was connected to Bryan Ansell as well, wasn't it?
Well, he owned it.
Right.
He owned Wargames Foundry. His dad, Cliff Ansell, ran it. And Bryan just let Cliff get on with it. And Alan and Michael designed the figures, which kept them happy. And if they were happy, they didn't mind designing figures that they were less interested in designing,
like the fantasy
the
stuff.
fantasy figures. Yeah, so they spent the days designing fantasy figures, and evenings designing historical figures.
Right. Okay.
They did a lot of designing.
Yeah.
An awful lot. And I mean, Wargames Foundry was nice. It was no more than 10 people.
Hmm.
And we're in Nottingham, based in Daybrook, then based third in Nottingham. And Bryan taught me to make molds, which he hadn't done before. And what happened was, I was making molds for Wargames Foundry, master molds and production molds. And I think there was a big, I think Bryan found something wrong with the way the Games Workshop molds being made at Eastwood.
Right.
And asked me to make the master molds for the Games Workshop. This would be in 1990, I think. Yeah,
Okay.
so 1990, I started. So Wargames Foundry was subcontracted to make master molds for Games Workshop.
Right.
Which I did. And eventually, 4 to 5 years later, Games Workshop said, well, we want to bring the master mold making back in-house. And Cliff said, I think you should apply for the job. So I eventually ended up going back to Games Workshop when they were at Eastwood. And then I was a master mold maker at Games Workshop. Then we moved to Lenton. And then I decided to go it alone.
Yeah. I mean, what is the sort of the process then of making a master mold? I mean, you mentioned Bryan.
A master mold.
Yeah. I mean, is that different to like a regular mold, or is it
Yes.
the materials? Right. Okay.
It's exactly the same, except you're given an original by the designer. And these are incredibly fragile. And what you have to do is you have to cut into the rubber. Now, the rubber is made up of layers, about 5 or 6 layers of thin rubber, pressed together, but not glued.
Okay.
So what would happen is you get a 9-inch disc of rubber, and you can get a scalpel and cut out little chunks of rubber to sink the figure into. Okay. And what you have to do is you have to sink the figure in about halfway, so that everything's supported, and you have to get it's sort of like a plane, which usually goes along the legs and the arm, and you sink the torso in, or the horse body in, or whatever. So basically, the figures cut into one side of the rubber. So everything's supported. Then you get the other side, and you press it between the two sides.
Right.
And hopefully, it shouldn't damage the figure. You should still get the figure staying as it is, because they're under an awful lot of pressure. Eventually, they're under 15 tons per square inch.
Wow.
Which, bearing in mind, a figure is only an inch high.
Yeah.
Each figure's got 15 tons on it.
Wow. Okay. So if I'm understanding that right, then you have the sort of rubber, the rubber disc essentially, and
Yeah,
you're cutting out maybe the core, the sort of the central mass,
the rough shape of the figure.
and then the rest, the actual once the figure is placed in it and the pressure is applied, the rubber is then essentially holding. It then remembers all of the indentations from the
Yeah.
detail.
What happens is you put a release agent on the rubber, which is either talc or flake graphite,
Okay.
which stops the two sides sticking together.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mold itself is in a steel can, which is the exact shape of the rubber. And you press it under heat and pressure. The pre-vulcanized rubber melts.
Okay.
It becomes liquid, and it takes up the shape of whatever's inside.
Right. Okay.
And then after 20 to 25 minutes, it goes solid. And then you can take it out and open it up. And you end up with perfect shape of what you put in.
Okay. And would you have to do that multiple times with the same sort of green original to get all of the different miniatures?
You only get one green.
All right. Okay.
You get one green. So you can normally get, I mean, it depends on the size, but currently you can get about 12, 25 mil figures onto a master model.
Okay.
And then if it was Games Workshop, say you're doing Space Marines, you'd get about 8 because
right.
they're bigger,
sure,
chunkier, and you have to be slightly further apart than so they don't come into.
Are you using that same green and repeating the process at different sort of intervals on the rubber then in order to create the separate?
No. I mean, like at the moment, the Perrys will design packs of 6 figures.
Okay, and you just do all 6 on the same.
Alan or Michael will design 6 different figures.
Right.
And the design will be usually based around a metal mannequin with green stuff embellishments on it. Things like packs or epaulets or whatever. They'd be done in green, but the basic core of the figure, and would be in metal.
Okay. And the actual green, then the original sculpts, sometimes are they destroyed by that pressure and that heat of creating
sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. They usually, you can reuse them.
Okay.
You can either reuse the metal mannequins, or sometimes you can reuse the green things like, say, faces or arms. You can reattach to them. But
it sounds like there's a bit of, like, especially with that initial creation of the sort of the void into which you're then going to place the miniature, there's like a certain amount of art alongside the sort of science of the process as well. Is that fair to say, that you have to sort of understand the materials? And
yeah, you have to understand what the rubber's going to do once it's in the press.
Yeah.
As I say, it goes up to 15 tons, and it really squeezes the figure. So you have to basically the physical act of doing it is you press the figure into the rubber gently, and it'll leave a very slight indentation, and you cut around that indentation. Then you do it again, and it'll leave another indentation, and you cut around that. And then when you do it again, the first indentation will show again. So you keep cutting down and down and down until you get a a rough three-dimensional shape for the figure to fit in, and you'll put your thumb on it, you'll rest your thumb on it, and it will, you can feel it has less, less give it in your, you can push against your thumb and think, well, that's fine, that'll do for that, we can, that'll cope with having 15 tons on it.
Yeah.
And that's the way it goes for that. But now also there's silicon molds. There's two types of molds. There's carbon rubber mold, which are the black ones, and there are multicolored silicon molds. Now they have less. They are far more forgiving.
Okay.
You don't have to cut so deep, or you don't have to. You only have to make vague indentations for them to rest in, because you use far less pressure on them.
Okay.
You only go to 3 or 4 tons with them. But the problem with silicon is, A, they're more expensive, and they work in a different way. They rely to actually vulcanize against something, the figure. They have to get that figure hot, right? And the problem with green stuff is its initial purpose is radiator repairs.
Okay.
It was designed as radiator repair putty, and if you mix it and press it against a radiator, it won't get hot. So green stuff is not suitable for use in silicon. But
right.
Green stuff is one of the few things that you can sculpt with without it, and it stays like plasticine for longer, which is what the designers want.
Yeah.
So you have to. So you got like these two very similar processes, but you have to be very careful as to what you put in each. Because conversely, if you put something that's fine in silicon into the black rubber, it'll come out flat as pancake.
Right.
You can the things you can press in silicon rubber that you can't press in the carbon rubber.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, you can actually do things like wood.
Oh.
Fimo. The Fimo stuff.
Yeah. So would there be some people working in that then? Is that for that, in order to use the silicon molds? Are there going to be some companies that are, or some sculptors who prefer to work in these other types of materials?
Well, there is a way around it, and the way around it is to make a resin. So if someone like, if you want to do, it adds another process, but you get the figures cast in resin, which if you make a resin mold, which I don't, mold for resins,
right?
You can put anything in there, right? Because it's cold cure, and green stuff, paper, or quiet paper, but sort of wood, whatever.
Okay.
And you make a resin, which can then go into silicon.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense then. So, but besides those sort of materials, then the silicon and the sort of rubber, has the mold making process changed much in the time period since you first started? No. Or is that like casting is the same?
It's exactly the same as when I started in 1982. The casting's the same, the mold making's the same.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah.
I think the constituents of the rubber are different,
Right.
but I don't know what. And you won't find many rubber manufacturers willing to tell you.
Sure. Proprietary stuff, I guess.
I think that sometime around about 1990 to 1995, the constituents of carbon rubber, the black stuff, changed quite significantly.
Right. So if the technology sort of hasn't really changed that much, is there I mean, it's similar to the mold making, I suppose. Is there almost a sort of craft, a kind of art aspect to the casting process as well, where you have to feel the material and know what you're doing, or, like, in order to get the best out of those materials?
Yes.
Right.
There is. People have spent 7 hours casting today. Casting, you can either do it or you can't.
Right.
It's not difficult. I mean, the rudiments to casting, so you basically just get the mold spinning up to speed, and you just pour metal down the middle. But you have to know how to pour the metal down the middle. It has to be poured in a smooth cone of metal. And if you're new to it, and people get put off by the fact that this metal is heated to 300 plus degrees centigrade, and you think, oh, well, it is dangerous.
Yeah.
Only if you pour it on yourself. But if you're confident with it, your machine is, if your casting machine is good enough, it's fairly easy.
Yeah. So where do the challenges come from? So you're literally, I mean, I imagine there's a challenge just even with the heat, and it was literally molten metal that you're ladling into the actual mold, right?
The challenge is you have to look at the figures and know where they're not going to work. A prime example of this is recently Perry's have started using CAD designed muskets for some of their figures. And the gun straps under them are too thin. So you have to get them to thicken them up, because what happens is the process of mold making thins out the gun strap very, very, very small amount. But it's just to the point whereby if you're casting it, you get a big hole in the gun strap.
Right.
So you have to realise that I've got a hole in the gun strap. You can either vent it or trim a very slight bit of rubber off.
Right. So that venting is, you're literally exactly what it sounds like, right? So you're creating holes.
You're venting, yeah. There's two types of venting. There's with a scalpel, which is things on the surface. Every figure has to have a back vent, which goes from the bottom of the base to out to the edge of the mold. I've all put a front vent on, which is from the other end of the base, just to get rid of a bit more air. And if you've got a gun, you always have to do it on the end of the gun.
Right. And that's because you need the metal to make its way all the way through that part.
Especially if you've got a bayonet. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can get away with it. Things without bayonets might not need the vent at the end. But if they've got the typical Napoleonic style pointy, spiky bayonet, they will need a vent on them.
Right. And so will that vent then, like, where does that metal go then? Is that just filling up an extra little void at the end, almost like flash metal that you chop
Yeah,
off?
it's like a little triangle of metal that you can pull off.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other type of venting is drilling, which
Hmm.
is you get a 1 millimeter drill, and this is like say got a coat tail sticking into the mould.
Hmm.
You put a drill hole at the end of it so that it remains sharp, which is a bit more difficult to. You can't really take that off. There'll always be a bit there.
Hmm.
But, I'm sure the average war game has got a knife sharp enough to
Sure.
cut it off.
Yeah. I mean that's like it's super interesting just to hear that the sort of the methodologies haven't changed. I mean, I guess you mentioned the sort of introduction of like CAD and computer aided design for sculpting, and obviously there's still a lot of sculptors who do that hand sculpted elements, like the Perrys largely, right? But
Yeah,
has that
I
changed
can't.
things?
Yeah, I can't see the Perrys ever moving away from hand sculpting,
Sure.
even if they do have computer aided muskets. I can't see them ever moving away from that.
Yeah.
However, I do have some customers who have obviously had computer aided design components, not
Mm.
necessarily military miniatures. I do work for a guy who does large scale aircraft, and in resin, but to make them stand up, the wheel struts have to be metal.
Mm.
So I end up doing the wheel struts, and they're obviously computer aided design because they're so precise and so there's no variation in, in the designs. So they're all done by must be done by CAD.
Yeah.
No way.
Sure. Yeah. I
And
mean, yeah, I mean, it certainly does that change your sort of role? Do you find yourself having to get more involved and sort of provide more feedback, like you mentioned about the sort of thinning out straps, or is it?
oh yeah, you have to tell them. You have to say, look, I mean, this is what I'm getting. And
Hmm,
show them, gun strap with them, where the two sides don't meet, and it's gone too thin. Can you next time when you do it, can you sort of put a dab of green stuff in there so that it doesn't, it doesn't happen.
yeah,
Okay. I
yeah.
mean,
I think
yeah,
just stepping back briefly to that earlier sort of portion of your career and sort of remembering what it was like. So obviously you'd started with Hal, who was not permanent member of Citadel stuff, but was
no,
working closely
yeah,
with Bryan Ansell and Rick on other sort of stuff. And you were working sort of in Bryan Ansell's, that early empire he kind of built of Citadel. I mean, do you reflecting now and looking back, what was the sort of feel? I mean, do you sort of have fond recollections of that period and that
I
sort of way
do,
of working?
I do. It's Bryan. I'm getting a lot of sunshine now. It's sunny down here. Bryan, he had faults,
Hmm,
but he was a great guy. He was a lovely guy. Um, and certainly when I started there, he was great to work for. I mean, when things started with the amalgamation of Citadel and Games Workshop, things got a bit less sociable,
hmm,
but it's to be expected, isn't it? I mean, it's a major amalgamation of two parts of the company, and he eventually ended up being the managing director.
hmm.
And but as a person, he was a nice. Um, he was good company. He was entertaining. Bit odd, but yeah, it's nice bloke.
Yeah,
Wouldn't say anything bad about him. He was a nice bloke. He had to do what he had to do. Running a company in the difficult 1980s.
Yeah. And then I suppose the sort of the final question, I guess, I was just curious about. You mentioned that you first started playing war games, or some of your earliest experience of playing war games were with Hal and with Rick, and you were playing some of the historical stuff, and they got quite excited about the fantasy stuff, and then they went on to develop 40K and Warhammer Fantasy. What was your journey as a war gamer? Did you stay in historicals? Did you play any of the Citadel games?
I stay in historicals.
Right.
I mean, if I certainly until my son was born, I used to go wargaming with Alan and Michael a lot, and Rick Priestley. But it sort of falls by the wayside when you start having families.
Sure.
So yeah, I was never enamored of fantasy gaming. I didn't mind science fiction, but certainly fantasy gaming, just couldn't quite get the enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's fair enough.
Those things, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But,
it's kind of remarkable to think, though, that the Lincoln, the model railway and wargaming sort of club that you were all a part of was so influential in so many ways when you look at what eventually came out of it. The games that you were playing back then in that club would ultimately be part of the journey of this huge tabletop hobby.
Yeah, you don't think so looking back, but I suppose it did, yeah. And as I say, I find it difficult to think of Rick as this wargaming, this famous wargaming personality. He's just someone I occasionally go for curries with and chats, and I suppose the other person as well is John Stallard. I've known John for 40 years. In fact, John, Rick, and myself used to share a house together when we first moved to Nottingham, when we moved over from Lincoln and Newark. So we shared a house and then went separate ways. But I don't look on. They're just friends.
Yeah.
In fact, some of my oldest friends. Certainly, Rick is probably my oldest friend.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah, as a group of friends, that you would all have contributed so much to so many people's hobbies and so many people's happiness, and enabled the creation of what Games Workshop has become and the games that it produces. So, thank you very much for your part in that.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
And thank you, Anthony, for joining me to have a chat and to sort of reflect on some of that period. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for chatting to us about those amazing experiences and all of that incredible history. It was a real pleasure. If you want to find out more about the conversations that Anthony refers to in Talking Miniatures, I've included a link to the book down below. And if you would like to support the work I do here on the channel, please feel free to check out my Patreon linked down below as well. I also greatly appreciate comments, likes, and subscribes here on YouTube. They are enormously helpful too. I have now launched a podcast, so you can listen to these interviews rather than watch them if you don't want to see my face. That can be found in your favourite podcatcher by searching for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery. Thank you once again to Anthony. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.